Meanwhile, G7 ministers are set to meet in Italy next week, where they'll discuss the International Criminal Court's arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. All EU countries are members of the court, which means they're obliged to enforce its warrants. But there's been diverging reactions within the EU and also with Washington, who've called the move outrageous. Well, to discuss, let's bring in Donatella Rivera, a senior crisis advisor at Amnesty International. Thank you so much for being with us here on France 24 today. Prime Minister Netanyahu is now officially a wanted man, but what does this realistically mean now for him and his former defense minister, Gallant? In other words, how likely is it for the case to go ahead?
Well, the case is going ahead because the arrest warrants have been issued. Now it's up to the members of the International Criminal Court, as you said, European Union countries and others, to enforce that warrant if and when those who've been indicted, in this case, Prime Minister Netanyahu, former Defense Minister Gallant, if they were to step foot on the soil of any country that is member of the International Criminal Court, those countries have an obligation to comply with those warrants and arrest those who have been indicted with the court, whether they are Prime Minister Netanyahu or of Israel or Putin of Russia. The court has spoken. These are independent judges that have decided that the request for warrants that was put forward by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court are well founded. And therefore, there must be no double standard. Nobody is above the law, whether they are the leader of an armed group, however powerful that may be, whether they are the leader of a country, a government official, regardless of what the reason or the cause. The fact is that not everything is allowed, even in war. And in this case, the judges believe that there are reasonable grounds to issue the indictment for war crimes and crimes against humanity against people on both sides of the conflicts, Hamas political and military leaders, as well as Israeli military and political leaders. And the members of the international courts must comply with those warrants.
Now, why has this arrest warrant then come now after over a year of Israel's assault on Gaza?
Well, obviously, these are complex processes. It took time for the prosecutor and this team to investigate the allegations and to formulate the request for the arrest warrants. That was done back in May, and it took a number of months for the judges of the court to obviously examine the material that was provided, that was put forward by the prosecutor, and to come to a decision. Also because there were procedural issues that were brought up by some members of the International Criminal Court as to the legitimacy of the court in this particular case. These were matters that were actually settled years ago, but because they were brought up, they obviously had to be examined. But the fact is that now the three judges, they are independent judges, have delivered their opinion. They have issued the arrest warrants. It has come now. We are just over a year into this particular round of hostilities in Gaza, and over a year after the attacks by Hamas in south of Israel. The court has determined that crimes against humanity and war crimes have been committed, and justice must run its course. And all those concerns have an obligation to ensure that that is the case. It is a very, very important development. It can and should be the beginning of the end of what has been a very pervasive atmosphere of impunity that, frankly, has not just allowed more violations of international law to be committed, but has encouraged more violations to be committed. Because when the parties involved feel that they enjoy impunity, that emboldens them and encourages them to continue with those practices. So this is a very, very important development, and one that can restore credibility in the whole existence of international law, that can give hope to the victims for justice, and that can ensure accountability for the perpetrators.
Now, you mentioned impunity. Speaking of impunity, what does it mean then for Israel's ability, if you will, to continue what it's doing in Gaza and beyond?
Well, all parties involved in this or any other conflict, y- they should not commit violations of international law, war crimes, crimes against humanity, regardless of whether there is a judicial process ongoing. The international law is very, very clear. And as I said, not everything is allowed, even in war. And um, the kind of crimes that we have seen being committed by Israeli armed forces day in, day out for the past 13 and more months must come to an end. Those violations should never have been perpetrated. I mean, this is one more message to say that, that they must come to an end immediately.
Now, Washington, as you know, has fundamentally rejected the ICC decision. Does this have an impact in any way, given they're still Israel's most staunch and, of course, most powerful ally?
Well, first and foremost, it has an impact on the credibility of the position of the United States administration. This is the same administration that hailed the arrest warrant issued against President Putin of Russia for crimes committed in Ukraine. It's the same court, it's the same system, and therefore there is absolutely no standing in welcoming that position when it comes to Russia, and saying that position is illegitimate when it comes to a country that happens to be an ally. So, I mean, ultimately. It's up to all members of the International Criminal Court, and indications at this early stage is that the majority of members of the International Court have so far signaled that they would comply if any of those who are concerned by these arrest warrants were to step foot on their country.
Donatella Rivera, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, but thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us